Okay, so now we're moving on to a really fascinating topic, one that I think will generate quite a bit of discussion and maybe a little bit of heat. We need a little heat because it's cold in here. So hopefully we'll get a little bit. The topic is, are you overspending? The future of document review in litigation. Just to tee this up, I mean, a couple of preliminary comments. I mean, as we were talking about in the last panel, the amount of data now that we have to review, protect, is growing at an incredible rate. And as I was mentioning earlier, for many corporations, there's no end in sight because of the fact that they really can't even delete what they have. So it just constantly accumulates. One recent study suggested that it's growing at a rate of 70% a year. So as a result, it continues to be a huge challenge for everybody to control the amount of time and money that's spent on the review process, which of course we know, we general counsel know, it's the most expensive part of litigation. And it's why there's been so much attention focused on the document review process. Well, the good news, I hope that we're going to hear today, is that there are technologies and processes, expertise and best practices that are available to address the challenge. You know, as we know, those practices continue to evolve. So what we've done for this panel is to collect a group of really thought leaders, a very impressive panel today that I'd like to introduce again as they speak. And as I did with the last hour, I'll ask them to speak for a few moments on a specific topic I think that is relevant to this general issue of overspending. And then we can have some discussion among the panel for the next segment, and then at the end I'll open it up again to questions so we can all talk and think together about this very important issue. So first, let me start with Palab, and Palab is the head of eDiscovery, the director of eDiscovery at Oracle, and someone who's created quite a reputation for himself, both within the company and within the community, and we're delighted, Palab, to have you. Can you give us an overview of the spectrum of review approaches and processes that are in use today? Maybe you can just kind of start us out here, and also review the impact of those in terms of the time required and the cost.
Sure. So I think we can all agree on the destination. You wave a magic wand at a pile of information, and nicely segregated is the chaff from the wheat, and you just hand over the wheat and throw away the chaff. But that destination, I'm sure we'll reach someday, but it will go through a lot of milestones. We are here now, and I think I'll try to lay the land for how we got here and what were some of the milestones. So this is a panel about how to reduce the costs for review, and I think we all will agree, I think other than maybe some of the vendors who charge by the gigabyte, that reduce the volume of data that you are analyzing to begin with. There's no question about it. Limit the number of data sources. Of course, cooperate with the other side, but limit the number of data sources, limit the number of custodians, and after that, limit the number of devices and things you need to collect from. The first panel talked about that. If your iPhone is synchronized with your email, do not collect from that iPhone. So this is just to reduce the number of documents that get into the analysis phase. Okay, so first milestone, step one, unvetted search terms. Luckily, the other side gave you reasonable search terms. And, unluckily, you had to come up with the terms. And it goes against the grain of the recent court opinions, which is you just cannot rely on search terms that outside counsel or in-house counsel came up with. But guess what? As long as you get agreement from the other side, possibly you will survive. The bad thing, usually the other side says, search your servers for your company name as a search term. So it doesn't go far. So next scheme, okay, search terms are fine.
That'll filter out about 2%.
Yeah. And always search your servers.
Yeah.
So the next one is search term refinement. Go into an ESI agreement with your opposing side, saying that I'm not going to agree on the search terms. Thanks for offering up the initial search terms, but we'll agree on a search term refinement process. We'll be as transparent as you want about what terms we are finally using and how we got there. Involve tremendous amount of review and sampling in the process, and the best part is you can create a target that no more than a certain percentage of documents we collect will move into review. And then, essentially do a linear review. So that's second stage. There's a lot of subtleties, and, people can actually bring in more tools into that refinement process. They can speed it up. But I think setting a clear deadline based on your own cases, that this is the point we normally need to reach with search terms, that's a good position to be. The third one is what I would call unsupervised learning. That's the official term in the technology space. It simply means you point a clustering type of tool. You tell the tool, I want my bucket to be categorized into, say, 5 clusters. And essentially the algorithms run to create the 5 best clusters. And, we have all seen how relevant those clusters are, usually not much. So, but at least you got your pile separated into some groups with some certainty that things in one group are similar. So it's a great, early case analysis tool. After that comes the group of tools called supervised learning. So supervised learning can be, categorization, but this is no longer out of nowhere. You actually tell the tool, this is the issue I'm looking for. You seed it with certain exemplars and let the corpus kind of form around those exemplars and around your issues. It's a great way of expediting the review. Another tool in that same vein would be email threading. So instead of looking at the 50 emails in a thread, you go to the top level email, you review one email, and essentially you can make the call on everything else. Similarly, say a document is flowing around in emails, possibly there are 20 versions. And if you spread it out, possibly there are hundreds of near duplicates of that document. If you want to make one single decision that this document is relevant, use near duplicate technologies. So these are all the milestones we came through till this point. You can expedite review. You can, essentially control your costs. And at this point, we are all at a juncture where predictive coding is coming in. Many people say, throw everything out. Predictive coding will do it all for you. I have a different opinion. I think it's another tool in your tool chest and need to use it with caution.
I have a quick comment on Palab's. Like, we talked about better collections, unvetted search terms. Let's do search term refinement, unsupervised learning. These are not necessarily like linear progression of a workflow, right? You might use some of these unsupervised like learning technologies like clustering very early in the process to help identify that tighter collection set, to help identify your search term, to do those search term refinements, right? And so these are all things in your tool belt.
These were just like, kind of how the industry came till this point, and there's going to be a lot of acceleration from this point on.
Yeah, no, I think that's a useful clarification, that this is not, in a sense, chronological. But one common element to all of these methods that you described, Palab, is that someone who's very familiar with the case needs to spend time with developing these teaching tools to familiarize the team of what the relevant search terms are and so forth. And how difficult is it in your experience, because obviously you're inside of a company, a large company, very prominent large company. How difficult is it to get the person who's knowledgeable about the case to spend the time that you need to teach the team about all the relevant search terms?
I'll actually take a slightly different approach to answering your question. I think you need to build up your partnerships. It can be a team in your discovery vendor side. it can be, a team on your review vendor side, but have a core team which has been with you on case after case. So when a new case comes in, there's only a delta which is really new. The rest, they know your company's documents. So at least on the documents and how things are structured, whether usually in this company there are 100 attachments to emails, or whether there are, 200 emails in a thread, that company knows, or that core team knows. Once we have that in place, outside counsel or in-house counsel who gets engaged very early on, normally they would know the innards of that particular case. So you put the generalist who know the data and the information of the company, and you bring in your in-house counsel or outside counsel who knows exactly which issue you're looking for. I think it's not that difficult to find these people to teach all these tools.
No, that's a great answer. Makes a lot of sense. Paige, let me ask you. Paige is the director of eDiscovery at Perkins Coie. That's right. I want to be sure I got that right. And Paige, now we're going to talk about some of the tools that Pallab just talked about, but could you talk about how defensible the use of those tools are in court when you actually get into litigation? If you're starting to use any one of the methods that Pallab talked about, or maybe even possibly predictive coding,
Right.
how will the court react?
So I think one of the major points I always make with our attorneys is defensibility doesn't start with document review, right? And I think that's a misconception. That's where we're seeing a lot of case law develop, but defensibility starts at the beginning. And my theory on this, and we'll talk about the cases, is that because everyone is so focused now on the protocols and whether or not you are reasonable, we have a heightened level of communication and openness that we want to have about these processes. I think that's going to trickle backwards. I think people are going to start wanting to know a little bit more about, well, how was the data collected? These are things that aren't being as discussed as I think they will be moving forward. So, we do finally have some case law. Good, bad, it's out there. We need it. There are things I like about it. There are things that I don't like about it. I'll touch on, 3 basic cases to Silvermore, right? Judge Peck. We're not going to get into all of the details because we could spend an hour talking about the 3 cases. But, in essence, the parties agreed to use predictive coding. And what Judge Peck was doing was helping them set out a protocol for how it was done. I'll tell you what gives our lawyers heartache when I talk to them is kind of what I'll call the open kimono effect, right? You get to see my non-responsive documents. You get to see my issue codes. These are the things that keep my lawyers up at night. Clean products case, right? This one, the thing that was fascinating to this about me is they disclosed that they were going to use search terms, that the defendants did. They spent what they said to be over 1,000 hours, 1,200 or so hours, not just the lawyers, but working with outside consultants to really develop these search terms. That's a pretty decent standard of care on its face. I'll tell you that I know there are cases that my firm are doing where we're not, using that level of standard of care when we're developing search terms. 3 million pages are produced. Then at the last minute, plaintiffs say, wait a second, predictive coding. We think we'd get a better, more complete data set with predictive coding. It led to a huge hearing in Chicago, right? I'm told that the number of suits in the meeting, male and female, was just amazing. In fact, one of our partners said, those 2 days, all of the attorneys in the room, I'm sure that 2-day hearing cost more than $1 million. So big deal. At this point, the plaintiffs have withdrawn their request until at least October of 2013. And then Global Aerospace, its first state case that predictive coding has been approved in, if you will. Again, same kind of protocol has been set forth where, the defendants will show the plaintiffs the non-responsive documents and such. And again, that's what's troubling. Right, from our perspective, you talk about being defensible. I feel like has the standard of care changed? There's still officers of the court that are going through and doing the document review and speaking to their processes and procedures and such. Never before have we really had to show non-responsive, non-privileged documents to the other side, so that's troubling. I do like, again, the openness that TAR seems to be pushing within the community, because I think we need more of that. I think that it will help us further refine discovery generally. It goes from being kind of a commodity process that we've treated it like, for the past decade. Throw bodies at it. Yes, we have search term development and such, but even when we're doing that, I don't really see the lawyers talking about precision and recall in search terms development the way they're talking about it now with TAR. So I think we're taking discovery and making it more of a science. We're making a smarter approach or developing a smarter approach to how we deal with this corpus of data rather than manufacturing a document production.
Paige, with respect to non-responsive documents, that you're expressing the concern that the opposing side will get a chance to see. But what they're seeing would be just a sampling, right? I mean, it's just to demonstrate the power of the predictive coding model that's been employed. The other side would have access to a sample of non-responsive, not the entire archive.
No, for example, to Silvermore, though, it was the training documents, right? And anything that they disagreed on, the plaintiffs and the defendants, Judge Peck actually made the decision on. So I think that's troubling just generally for the lawyers. They're feeling like never before did they have to do that. We don't give our hard copy training documents that we give our attorneys to opposing counsel to have them review. So why should this be different?
I see. So that's the training materials are
absolutely
really
yeah.
a great concern. No, that makes sense. That may be we may be on a learning curve here. So these may be early problems that we're going to overcome.
I think that's it. I think we're all getting comfortable with it. I think if we flash forward 18 months, I think we're going to have different case law that's not going to require this. But everybody's just dipping their toe, if you will, into this world. And firms and corporations have been using predictive coding for years now. I know one law firm has been using it since 2009. I was at a meeting earlier this week where Qualcomm said they've been using it for 2 years, but we haven't had case law about it. In the case law that we now have, again, it's not my ideal case law. It doesn't make my partners go, I'm ready. And they go, oh God, I'm still scared, So, it's tough. I mean, anything I can get my hands on at this point that shows the judges are open to it. There was an article in LTN the other day, I think on the 7th, talking about Georgetown and, panel of 5 judges going, please use this. I mean, you better believe that that's being circulated at my firm. and also ways that, defensible, I think the other major issue is with predictive coding. It's not yes or no. Do I use it? Do I not? How do I use it, right? So use it to prioritize your review. Get your lawyers comfortable with that. Share those types of results with opposing counsel. Listen, we've been reviewing data for 2 weeks, and I've got a 0.3% responsive rate at this point. I'm not getting new responsive documents. Again, it's about reasonableness, right, and proportionality. So I think that's the way that we're slowly getting comfortable with this.
Great.
I have one comment on I think defensibility is a lot about repeatability too, right? So I start out with this corpus. This is what I ended up with, and how do we have a process that's repeatable, right? So number one, it's got to be documented. You follow it, and 2, you need to have the transparency and the tooling, right? So if I did need to repeat my exact steps to get the exact same results, I could, right? And I think that's very important when you use some of these more, I guess, newer techniques.
Well, Andy, I'm glad you spoke up, and let me introduce Andy. Andy Cieja from kCura. This time we got the CEO. And Andy, I wanted to ask you to speak because you're obviously in the best position here to do this on the types of technology that are currently available in the market today to help control the document review process.
So I think Palab actually did a pretty good job of touching on this stuff. So I mean, what are the technologies that are available, right? So we do have we talked about these unsupervised technologies, the things that do the clustering. Now, what powers it? What powers what actually does the analysis and the conceptual, taking the documents and building the different conceptual buckets? There's all kinds of different technologies that do that, right? So there's latent semantic indexing, there's Bayesian. It's probably too geeky for this room in here, right? But there are a variety of technologies that will do that analysis. And so you have the unsupervised learning, you have the supervised learning, the categorization, in my opinion, predictive coding is really like a supervised learning model, right, with some type of validation on it.
I think I would call predictive coding as active supervised learning and categorization as passive.
Passive. Yeah. I think that's a very good assessment of that, and I'm going to steal that. Thank you. Start using that. But what I think we're, and then we talked about email threading and near duping and some of these other technologies as well. But what I believe where we're starting to get a lot of efficiency gains is like when you start combining all these technologies together, right? It's not necessarily email threading and predictive coding. It's not necessarily like email threading or categorization or clustering or categorization, right? It's like, how do we stitch together all these technologies together to get really efficient really quickly, right? So think about a world where I look at a data set and I do email thread analysis and find my primary documents, and then I cluster those, for example, right? So this is how we're going to get like massive efficiencies, is really bringing these all together. Now, our responsibility as a vendor, right, is to make that easy, right? And so that's what we're working on.
What are you working on? What's new? What's in the lab that you're working on?
Well, we are working on some of these what I'm going to call like structured data analytics, right? So I think things like email threading fall around that, near duping, right? So how do we very tightly integrate those technologies into Relativity? Our biggest problem today, in terms of one of our biggest problems, is handling the volume of data, right? I'm one of the original architects of Relativity. I'm a computer programmer. I'm not a lawyer, right? When we start talking about clean products and stuff, right? I'm hoping that no one asks me these questions, right? We never designed Relativity to store 80 million documents in a single workspace. It works.
And guess what? Oracle gets cases like that.
Yeah, it works.
It's real life.
It works because it was well designed, but that wasn't its intention. But bottom line, these cases are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Fun fact, right? So at the end of 2010, if you take the largest X percentage of our cases, they average to 2.2 million records. If you do that today, it's 9 million, right? These cases are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we're fighting that. Right? How do we make our database more scalable? How do we make it more distributed? And not only that, is like we have to build a system where it can run on 100 servers, but it still requires the one IT guy to run it. Right? So we have those are some of our big challenges there. Data, big data, larger data sets.
Good luck. This is when the lawyers are thankful that we're not computer science people having to deal with these issues. Okay, Sonia, so now it falls to you. We've been talking here about predictive review, predictive coding. As Palab and Andrew have kind of reviewed the various technologies available, it's very clear that predictive coding is working its way up the stack and is going to be an increasing presence. So could you perhaps talk a little bit about some of the best practices, if you will, that are emerging already on the use of predictive coding, and in particular, if you can, provide some case examples of where it's been used successfully or unsuccessfully?
Okay. I do want to add one thing to the end of what Andrew said, and one of my favorite new features that they're working on is the integration with the Quivio Zoom actually in Relativity. So I'm thankful for that.
Part of our story is we're a platform. We have APIs, we have SDKs, and it's Quivio who's building that integration.
So we're excited about that. I'm going to talk about two different use cases for the technology, and then I have a few tips on how to actually make technology-assisted review tools really work the best for you. So I work with the consulting team at SFL Data, and we're the ones that actually run the cases using predictive coding. So I've got about 10 years of experience in this. I was at another company before this doing it. I'm really happy to be at SFL Data using different tools. So it's cool. The two main uses that I see are either for culling purposes or for prioritized review, as Paige mentioned. So I'll talk about prioritized review, and then I'll go through the numbers that I just handed out to everybody so you can actually see a case by the numbers. When you're prioritizing for review, you don't actually throw anything out. You actually keep it all in the system, and you choose what you're going to review based on what relevancy rankings come back from the machine learning phase. So anything that's above a certain score, let's just say between 0 and 100, anything above 90, you're going to review first. And then you're just going to review down the line until you either decide you're done reviewing because you're not finding any responsive documents, which is usually what happens when the score is below 50, or you can keep reviewing until the very bitter end. It's just up to you and what your review team and resources are like. So I'm seeing that, and that's an easy, low-risk way to start using these tools. So instead of reviewing every single document randomly, you're spending time to review about 3,000 documents to train the system, and then you get your priority rankings that way and can start your review in a prioritized fashion. And I think that's a really low-risk way for people to get started with these tools because you're not actually throwing anything out. You're actually able to review it all. The more interesting case is when you start saying, I'm not even going to spend more time reviewing these low responsive documents. I'm going to spend all my time on the top 10% of documents and review those. So the handout with all the colored numbers on there, I'm just going to talk through that example. This was for an arbitration, and they put about 365,000 documents in the system to begin with. They actually decided to do keyword culling before doing any training in predictive coding, and I would say about 90% of the work that I see actually does some kind of culling before putting it into predictive coding tool. Of those documents, about 108,000 of them were remaining, and 92,000 of them went into Zoom. So they Equivio Zoom, and the data was hosted in Relativity and reviewed there, and then back and actually reviewed in Relativity. So they merged those two tools nicely, as I mentioned earlier. The team chose to review a very small set of documents once they looked at what's coming up relevant and what's not. They had a cutoff point that gave them about 2,000 documents, a focus on those, and when they brought families back in, it was about 7,800 documents, that first orange square at the bottom of the triangle right in the middle of the page. And then for quality control purposes, anything below that cutoff point, they chose to review about 4,000 documents plus families. And so at the end of the day, they reviewed about 13,000 documents, and then things that did not go in to be machine trained, they reviewed those separately. So about 30,000 documents, so about 10% of the overall document population. And then they ended up producing around 2,000 documents, so less than 1% actually got produced. So I would say this model follows the machine learning that I've seen over the last 10 years. So what you're actually reviewing is a fraction, so about 10%, and then you're actually producing about 1% of the documents. So you can see the benefit of using one of these tools to actually get to the relevant stuff very, very quickly. I would say that what we talked about earlier about choosing a case expert to train the system is really the most important step, and I'd say that's really one of the most highly regarded success factors for making these tools work. I think the other thing is from a quality control standpoint.
Who's the case expert?
Who is the case expert?
Who's the ideal case expert?
Someone who knows the case really well, someone who knows the case strategy. It's usually a partner. It could be an in-house counsel depending on how closely they know the data, but most of the time I've seen that it's a high-level associate or a partner who's trying the case.
High-level part, I mean, how much of their time are you going to get? Realistically.
It depends. It really depends on how much time they have till some deadline in the case. So if they've got an arbitration in 3 weeks, they're going to devote the 4 or 5 hours, a couple days to actually train the system. If they've got an arbitration and it's 18 months away, obviously they're going to take their time and it's going to fit in among other motion practices and that kind of thing. So it just depends on what case deadlines are driving the machine learning and how fast they actually need to review the data. This particular case that I've given you as an example was 3 weeks from start to finish, from the moment data came in to train the system in 5 days to actually review the data, do the quality control on it, and then actually produce it and get it out of the door.
So Sonia, this was an arbitration. That means you are not really facing the full brunt of FRCP.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So in that case,
just wanted to clarify.
Right. So in that case, if you were facing a different situation where it was an arbitration and it was more contentious, then I would recommend the prioritized review side to be able to not call anything out, but just say we're going to start it and review from beginning to end.
Andy, you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, and again, one of our challenges is how to, we need to get these people with more, we talk about the senior partner, the associate that has all the understanding of the case in front of the technology sooner, right? And how do we build technology in a way where it makes sense for them to do it? It's attractive for them to do it, right? They want to do it, right? Instead of like, oh, I'm reviewing documents. We're thinking about that too. And
Good.
That's an important part of the equation.
That's a very important dimension to this puzzle. And Paige, I wanted to follow up with you on this point, because how as predictive coding, predictive review, and technology-assisted review just generally becomes more and more prevalent, how do the roles of the team change? The partner, the associate, the outsourced firm, the eDiscovery experts, how do everyone's roles change to adapt to this usage of predictive review?
Well, it is changing. I mean, it's always evolving, right? But I started off at Perkins 5 years ago. We have an in-house discovery center, document review, basically attorneys, right? And I called it the dry cleaner effect, right? The attorneys would come down, drop off discovery on a Monday and want to pick it up on a Friday, and we wouldn't see a lot of them in between that. So we changed things pretty quickly, where there was a lot of involvement, and that became one of our selling points. Active partner involvement, active associate involvement. We were right there on staff or on site, so it's great. Moving forward into this new world, I'll tell you, I'm seeing a lot more partner involvement in the education piece. Of course, they want a lot of insight and such into how do I write the stipulation? How do I talk to the SEC about us using this technology? So I see them strategically involved in discovery in a way that, it's been, again, kind of just a manufactured thing for many, many years. The associates, hands-on. They're definitely in the documents, and I agree with Sonia. It has to be a high-level associate. Don't give me a baby first or second year and say they're going to train this technology. They're still trying to figure out what discovery really is at this point. So I think that's really important. The commoditized role, if you will, of document reviewers, yeah, that's diminishing. We don't see that. The numbers that we saw years ago. It wasn't a big deal for me to have 110 people on site. We're not going to do that. I've been telling my management for several years, we won't see that anymore. What we're going to see is us plateau with this number, and then we're going to continue to grow this staff attorney model. I'm a big believer in the staff attorney model, kind of the middle land, if you will, between the document reviewers and the associates, because there is a lot of analysis that needs to happen. And if an associate gets involved in one of these big cases, it becomes their life. How quickly does the technology change, Andrew? I mean, it's pretty quickly. So we need people that are specialized in understanding how this technology works so they can help slice and dice the data with the associates. And that's what we're seeing with the staff attorney model. So less document reviewers, more staff attorneys, and partners at a strategic level that they haven't been involved in a while.
So Paige, you're actually saying that all these document review vendors who have literally thousands of people to throw at, they're essentially going to go away.
Not go away, diminish, right? Because I think we got to keep pace with
No, I'm
all
thinking
the big
the
data.
law firms would get more involved, like Perkins, Coie.
Right.
And in that case, why would these document review vendors exist?
Yeah, I'm happy to be positioned where I am.
I don't think the document review is going to go away
It's not
completely.
gonna go
I think
away.
there's a
I've asked a
spectrum.
polarizing
Right.
question, sorry.
Well,
I think it's a spectrum of what kind of review do you need at that point. If you've done prioritized review, do you want your associate or your partner reviewing documents that have a 50% relevancy ranking or not? No, you might put a different team of reviewers on that.
But why can't the staffing firms shift their profile a bit where it's
Right.
not just considered first pass? They're actually doing a bit more of that substantive work, right? Like we're selecting them, we're giving them more time to train up on the material, and they're still doing that work.
Yeah,
Right.
my problem with that as outside counsel is here today, gone tomorrow, right? They're gone as soon as I get to a certain point in my project and I don't have anything for them to do. Whereas if they're in-house at a law firm, I get to the next stage or I get to depositions and I go back to those people that have done the analysis on the work. That's why I like this model. Again, they're not going to go away. I don't think we're going to need the numbers that we've had for a really long time. And I think there's an opportunity for those document reviewers that want to
I'm
step it
actually
up.
thinking that
can
there
go
is
to the
no
next
room
level.
under the model that you're talking about. There's no room because the algorithms work in a very strange way. The thing is that your corpus, if it is 1 million documents, say you need to review 3,000 documents. If it grows to 10 million, maybe 5,000.
Right.
It's a very small delta. And actually the number of documents you need to review depends on your target accuracy. It doesn't depend on anything else.
And I guess also it depends on how far we're projecting. I mean, are we talking about 2 years or are we talking about 10 years? 10 years, we might not have a document review, niche anymore.
So what happens though, so our data sets are getting bigger, right? I quoted some numbers there, which means here we have an example where the responsive population is quite small, but if we have more documents, the responsive population is going to be much bigger, right? Technically.
Possibly.
Possibly, right? And then, someone is going to need to review that, whether it's in-house people, maybe it's contract people, right?
But you're going to keep building the tools, right, that help us get to that.
We are. No, we are. And actually, Relativity Assisted Review in 7.5 actually does key issue type of review as well, right? So we actually have the tools to do that next level review using predictive coding. This is a technology, so.
Well, and I think the other important thing to remember is when you get to the point of trial, it doesn't matter really how large the case is. It comes down to, a couple hundred documents, maybe. I don't really see that exponentially growing as the data sets continue to grow. I still think it's going to come down to, just getting your hands on the right documents that are going to be key in taking
That is
the
right
trial.
for trial, but as far as discovery obligations go, you are still supposed to hand over, the entire population of potentially responsive.
Agreed.
We're still seeing multi-million page productions go out the door, right? That's
true. Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
I want to add one more use case then. That's a really good point, Andrew, about being able to analyze a set that gets turned over to you very quickly. If you've done your own training on your own data, you can still use all that machine learning on whatever data sets get turned over to you. Or even if you haven't used it on your own and you're getting one of those, it's easier to train on that very quickly and get a handle on what's been turned over to you. I've seen some sets where you think what you got was a supposedly good production, and they rarely are. So you can really quickly find the most relevant data in that set when you're getting a production made to you.
Sonia, let me ask you a question about costs, because we've talked about all these different tools that are available. How do you decide to use the right technology at the right time in order to cut costs? I mean, what's the practical lessons here from your experience?
I think it depends on what your purpose is, and if you're trying to cut a data set down from 3 million documents to 2,000, you're going to spend less time trying to do that than actually reviewing every single document in that set. And obviously, if you're reviewing 3,000 documents and not 3 million, it's going to be less cost. It may be a little more expensive up front because you're paying a higher priced partner or associate to review those to begin with and train, but you don't have the actual first pass review costs. So it's kind of weighing those two numbers and deciding, yes, it makes sense to do this, or no, it doesn't in this case. And it depends on what your purpose is and how much time you have. Time, I usually see time becoming the most important factor, and then money goes out the window. And people just want to get it done, and so they're looking at whatever way they can. So I think that has to be considered as well.
Mm-hmm.
So can I ask a question, because you have used it? So there are many vendors who are saying that, don't use anything but predictive coding. Why not do that?
You're preaching to the choir. I mean, I would recommend that you only use predictive coding because the tools work, the algorithms work to separate the junk stuff from the actual substantive data. But I don't think people are ready to take that leap yet. I think people still want to do some kind of culling. I completely recommend doing objective culling up front, however you can, either date ranges or custodians or file types, however you're going to do that. There's no need to pay for reviewing data that's not going to be relevant to whatever specs you have. I definitely recommend doing that.
Does it make your predictive coding process less accurate, or it doesn't have any impact?
I think the more junk you have in there, the more delineation you're going to have. That pile of data that's labeled junk is just going to be bigger. It will be harder to find if you've got a very low prevalence rate, meaning how much relevant documents do you have to non-relevant documents. You may have to train more, but it's still going to work.
Yeah, and I also think it depends on the corpus of the data set, right? If you're dealing with a data set that is, a ton of spreadsheets, that might not necessarily lend itself to predictive coding technology. It also could depend on what is a relevant document. So let's say the case is about, I'm a wagon manufacturer, right? And I make red wagons and I make blue wagons, right? Well, that's important, right? And maybe like if the delineation between responsive and not responsive is that close, well, the system might get confused, right? So I think there's some things like that that you do need to take in consideration as well.
I think that's a really important point in training. The more black and white you can be about how the issues are that you're coding or how a document is relevant or not is really important. The grayer it is, the harder it is for the machine to learn from that gray area. Yeah. So it straightens them out into responsive and non, and then it's going to have them along a spectrum and force you to decide where that line is. So I think you might end up training a lot longer, but it will still provide useful information.
A really good discussion of the pros and cons of predictive coding. I mean, I think maybe one way to think about it, and Paige, I'll ask you to comment on this, is you're talking to lawyers who are learning about this for the first time. They're trying to understand it. How do you frame that discussion of the pros and the cons from the lawyer's point of view?
Yeah, I think it's about strategically positioning themselves. That's one of the things I always touch on is, think about it really as ECA, right? Getting to the key information quicker and more quickly in their cases. I think that's huge, so there's a strategic advantage there. Of course, you talk about the cost differences. That's tremendous. They've learned that that's incredibly important. We talk about risk. That's a big deal to them. And then candidly right now, again, I'm still getting our lawyers to dip those in this.
Risk. And why is that the case? In spite of such obvious, everyone is.
Palab, you're an advocate. No, I'm asking for a more dispassionate view of the pros and the cons. When you talk about risk, Paige, do you mean legal risk? When you talk about the risk of employing this new technology?
Let me give you an example. I had a lawyer in my office last week, and he's got a case we're using predictive coding on. We're responding to a governmental entity on this piece, and he is terrified to actually tell the government that we have used this predictive coding technology. Doesn't matter that we know many other firms have used it with this particular entity before. It doesn't matter that we're incredibly defensible. I mean, you talk about our defensibility binder and our process. It's all there. I'm sending articles where certain people are weighing in and saying this looks good, and he says, I'm afraid I'm going to be accused of obstruction of justice here. I mean, this is how terrified they are about it. So they have a responsibility, they believe, of seeing or getting every document that is responsive to whom it needs to go to. And then you start even quoting the risk around or the inefficiencies around human document review. When I start talking about that, their jaws are dropping, going, you mean your reviewers aren't good? No, all of us. It's not just my review team, right? It's all of us. There are inaccuracies there. Right. I think it's unfamiliar. I think change is hard. I think technology is hard for lawyers to weigh in on. And this is just different than what they've been using before.
Are the tools actually forcing the lawyers to make some statistical decisions? Is that one of the issues?
Yeah, they don't really understand the statistics, I think, and so they want a black and white. This is why I made this decision. Yeah. I've had lawyers say, I want a declaration from the vendor saying that this decision made sense to them.
Or this percentage is correct.
That's not their place, right? They're the statistics, and then they require analysis and reasonableness.
But that's the mindset of the lawyer, right? They think about risk all day long, right? And can you prove with utmost certainty that this stuff works?
Question out there.
Yeah.
You can't.
Yeah,
exactly. Back in the room.
He can't contain himself.
I'm surprised nobody has said anything about the Hooters case and the order by Vice Chancellor Lassiter in Delaware, and I'm curious, has anybody seen any kind of reaction to that? Because I know I have. It's been rather profound. I've had partners come to me and say, "Oh, predictive coding, we have to do that now, right?" Because of that decision. So I'm just curious if anybody else is in that camp.
The case Bill's talking about is out of the Delaware courts, and the court had a bench order telling the parties they needed to go away, find a predictive coding vendor that they both could use, and come back or tell them why they shouldn't do it. So there wasn't even an issue about it, and he told them they needed to go use predictive coding.
So it's wanted, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the thing that's troubling to me in that bill is that they're forcing the parties to do something they hadn't even considered or maybe not wanted or may not be right for them. I mean, I'm all for using predictive coding and using these tools, but to force the parties when they don't have an idea about it, it seems a little heavy-handed to me. But I'm glad to see it, and if it pushes it in the right direction to get other people using it, I'm all for that. Now there's more
Two
questions.
ends.
Yeah, I don't know if Laster's decision was based on exasperation with the parties, but it did seem very odd for the judge on his own to make such a strong directive, to issue such a strong directive to use a technology that they hadn't even been employing. Hands, we're open for discussion, so please feel free to join in. Yes, sir.
Two quick questions. One may be longer to answer than the other. First one is on the philosophy of using search terms. So people have been talking about using search terms and such a great thing to get agreements, to reduce costs. But what is the panel's thoughts on not using search terms? I can see benefits of doing that, such as you are not opening the entire kimono, you're not exposing the work product to the other side, and you can sort of let the litigation flow, take control of the document process, you produce whatever you want, then the opposing counsel can follow up on particular sets of documents produced. And it's more a natural progression from that point on. So barring the court's requirement of using search terms, what's the panel's thoughts on the pros and cons of not using search terms? So that's the first question. The second question is to Andy about the near duplicates and email thread. So what are the technical, I'm just trying to get a little bit sample appreciation of why is it so difficult to get those things locked down and to get them knocked out quickly? To me it seems it's more like a low-hanging fruit. I just want to get a little...
Can I take Roy's first question?
Sure.
Okay, and then you can take his second one.
Okay.
So you echoed my thoughts. I think we should always use search terms, albeit in a very, very sophisticated manner, not in a flimsy manner, to reduce the volume of documents that moves into any kind of review. Just because if a whole pile moves in, even a 99.9% accuracy may not be good. Mm-hmm. It would be great if a very small number of documents were there. But say you are hitting a 99% accuracy, which is great, but it's not great if your corpus is 100 million documents. That's a lot of responsive documents which will get left behind. So I'm with you, unless somebody disagrees.
I think it all depends on what both parties agree to, right? I mean, the nice thing about search terms, right? So search term custodian's date range is that there is something that I can conceptualize that I am going to get all that stuff, right? And so what could that be? Maybe it's like, okay, we're going to hand over these 10,000 documents, but here are the specific 100 that are the seeds, for example, and maybe that's what is negotiated, right? So I think, as more people use this technology, we might see things like that happen.
Go ahead.
No. I was going to answer the next question, but we should tie this one out.
Just to play devil's advocate, keyword search has its good points and bad points. I think it's really easy for people to think they understand how they're working, and the use of Westlaw and Lexis and Google and all those give people a false sense of security that it's actually working like they think, but it's very over-inclusive and under-inclusive and may miss stuff that you don't even know is there.
What if parties agree?
If parties agree, they've dug their own grave. I mean, then they live with the data set that they agreed to. And there's nothing wrong with that. I just think there's no case that's ever said keyword search is okay, but everybody's doing it. So why are they waiting for a case that says predictive coding is okay to use? I think if they are going to do keyword search, then it needs to be a negotiated look at the data first so that you have some clue about what words and information is actually in your data set. I mean, it really... it's disheartening to see people go off and negotiate it in a vacuum. I think what Palab was saying is exactly right. You need to do it in some concerted manner. I think iterative keyword search, where you look, is this really pulling back what I think it is? Is this word working? Is it over-inclusive, like the Fannie Mae set of terms, where it brought back, I think, 80% of their data set? That was not helpful. So I think if you are going to do it, it really makes sense to look at the data and then to do it in an iterative manner and sample what you've left behind and sample what you have to make sure you're finding what you think you are.
I think ultimately it's a function of balancing cost, that is the reduction in cost through the use of search terms, with the risk that you're going to eliminate a relevant document.
Yes.
And both parties, I mean, if they do come to an agreement, that's ideal,
Yeah.
because then they've come to they've met in the middle, if you will, on that balance.
And get the court to make it an order so that the court's blessed it and other people can see that it's reasonable as well.
But let's not forget cost, because that's really a very important consideration from the litigant's point of view, at least from the defendant's point of view, not always from the plaintiff's. I'm biased, I have to admit. Biased statement. Andy, how about the second part of the question?
Yeah, so why is doing threat analysis and near duping a difficult problem? So the near duping is actually not that tricky, right? There's a lot of algorithms out there that we can use to do that work. So that's not that bad. The threading is very different, because the threading we're looking at the body of the email, and the body of the email has specific metadata embedded with it. There's metadata fields that we need to look at. There's data coming from different email systems at different points of times when things have been upgraded, right? Data starts changing, right? Companies go through transitions. Email may be coming from asage@kcura.com, then next week it's asage@kcura.corp.com. System needs to be smart enough to handle those variations. Right now in Relativity, we probably have well over 10 billion files under management, right? And for us, we just need to make sure that, hey, this technology, it needs to be working, it needs to be accurate, because people are going to be making some very important decisions about the results of this stuff. So it's the variations of the data, in short.
Questions, more hands? Way in the back of the room, sir.
Yeah, this question is for Paige. So Paige, you mentioned that you're a fan of the staff attorney model.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, as I understand it, staff attorneys bill anywhere from $225, $265 and upwards, whereas a fully outsourced document review provider might bill a fourth of that on an hourly basis. So I guess my question is, what is it that the end client is getting in working with the staff attorney, as opposed to working with a managed review company who specializes in very similar type services?
Right. Oh, I wouldn't say they're very similar services. That's the difference, right? So
in terms of the document review piece.
I guess it depends on what you're using for the technology, how you're using the technology. It comes down to the people and where you're applying them in your process, right? So the staff attorney model, again, I'm advocating using that when you're using something like predictive coding to get rid of the junk, right? And then you're using these people to do more strategic analysis of the documents. Our staff attorneys, for example, USPTO attorneys, I cover 9 foreign languages. They're, seasoned litigators. They're not the profile of the document review company. Further, they're with us for long periods of time, 4 or 5 years at a time, typically at this point. So they're around throughout the life of the case, and we can use them in different ways that we can't use a, commodity document reviewer.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
Subject matter expertise.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Oh, ma'am, I'm sorry.
So, like Andrew, I'm a computer scientist, okay? I'm not a lawyer. And I have tested extensively relativity assisted review and equivio relevance, and they work. They do what they say they're going to do, okay? And then depending on how well you train them, you're going to get, you're going to get what you ask for. My question though is, I understand the math, okay? And I understand the statistics. And what I hear, what I see from people who don't is, oh my God, are we doing enough, sampling? Are we doing enough? How do we prove that this is right? And my question is, in your experience, when you get to the point at the end, okay, and you're surrounded by people who aren't statisticians, how do you explain that this is a good enough sample set? I've done enough, testing to make sure I'm right.
I think for us that if you believe in statistics, you believe in the process, right? Mm-hmm. And so for us, this is one of our challenges as a vendor of this technology is, I remember when we started talking about RAR, we need to be able to explain statistics in 2 slides, right? In 2 slides, we got to explain statistics and get people to buy into it and help correlate where statistics is used in everyday lives, whether it's the food I eat or the car I drive, right? And get people to believe in it and understand it, right? And so to me, I think it's a lot of educational and awareness, and there's stuff that we can do in the technology to help as well, but if you believe in statistics,
How about remove it completely from lawyers? Do your technology in such a way that it's never exposed?
Well, then they have to basically just believe in us, which I guess is, but there's
Which would be great.
Yeah,
but you come in and you defend it.
Well, then we have to defend the statistics.
Yes, exactly. Who better to defend, you or the lawyer?
The process with the statistics?
Yes.
Probably our statisticians.
Good.
But I think one of the things that's really important to remember is that lawyers are hired for their judgment and their experience, and that that's an essential part of this process and using the technology. And that doesn't go away just because you're relying on statistics to train the software and shake out, the data to get the good stuff at the top.
All I'm saying is that outside counsel or in-house counsel should not be making the calls that this is the statistical number we are shooting for. If the technology can hide that, but make all the decisions on their judgment, I'm fine.
But I think that's how the tools work. I mean, the tools have the numbers in them, and you can choose how deep or how shallow you want to be in your review of the data and how in-depth you want to be for your quality control process. I mean, it's no different than saying, I've withheld all my privilege documents because it fell into the privilege screen and keep them all out because it fell in there without ever reviewing them. I'm just going to make a blanket decision to keep all those out. That's a judgment call without actually having to review the data. You can use the tools to do that as well.
Yeah, and I think, this is part of the statistics, right? Like, we cannot prove with equivocally that this is working on 100% of the documents. We can't. But what we can prove is that within a 95% confidence, we have a 95% confidence level within a 3% margin of error, that we can, right? And that's where we're saving all the money.
And you notch it up to 99% with 1% margin of error. Suddenly you're not saving that much money at all.
You got to review a lot more documents, right? And so, but again...
But we're not manufacturing rocket parts either.
Exactly.
But again, it's like, it's getting people to understand, okay, we're saving a shitload of money here, right? It's true, right? But with that comes with that small risk.
It's balancing the risk against the cost. Truly, I mean, it is. And I think as much, Palab, as you would like the statisticians and the experts to have control of this topic, I'm afraid you're going to need to explain it to the lawyers. They will need to get comfortable with the risk, and to understand the risk, they need to understand the underlying statistics.
Yeah.
It's just the reality of life.
I'll tell you.
What's your opinion?
Well, no, I agree that the lawyers have to understand it. At the end of the day, they're the ones standing up in court saying we've done a reasonable job here.
Absolutely.
To that end, there's a Statistics 101 class that's going to come out for attorneys in our firm. I'm serious.
That's it.
Where here's what you need to know. I'm not going to get up there and do a college lecture for 2 hours about the F1 measure, but I'm going to hit the very basics in 30 minutes. This is what precision means. This is what recall means. Here's richness. Because if they can't talk at that level about this, they're going to get eaten up by their opposition. Or the worst thing I could do is not position one of our attorneys to at least have a decent conversation with opposing counsel about the very basics of the statistics.
No, that's great, Paige. Great idea.
I mean, one of the things that keeps coming out in the Sedona conference, discussions about it, and the judges, and they get all heated about it because people keep asking, when are we going to come out with a case? Well, we've come out with cases, but that hasn't solved the problem or the perception of using tools. They get all heated about it because the scientific reference manual has a whole chapter on statistics and expert witnesses being able to testify about them and how they work. And it's usually used in infringement cases for trademark and that kind of thing. So there are, witnesses that testify and follow that. What they're saying is we don't need a whole chapter on technology-assisted review. It already exists in the statistics chapter, so no need to go elsewhere. You can already rely on that from an expert witness standpoint.
Can I make one note? So there is a study that Electronic Discovery Institute is conducting with one of Oracle's old data, and at this time, potential participants are about 30 solution providers on predictive coding side, and the baseline will be calculated over at least a dozen human review teams. So essentially, the baseline will be what the current human review standards are, and 30 potential. And to Stanford, thanks to Dan. Dan actually formed the connection with the professors. They are leading the study. It should have started this week, but we had some issues about, we didn't want to send all the documents out. We have got that under control, so I hope the study kicks off, like first week of January next year. So it's around the corner. It has been a very long wait, 2.5 years.
It could be quite important. Let me open the floor for any additional questions. Yes, in the back of the room.
So in this trend of cooperation and trend of predictive coding, how do you envision the need for dialogues shifting to accommodate for predictive coding? For instance, do you envision the parties discussing and agreeing to
God, I hope not. Not before they get in there and mess with the data, right? And start understanding what they have. Honestly, I think that meet and confer could be pretty messy for a while.
Even after Statistics 101?
Well, no, I hope not. That's after the class. Right.
I think people need to come prepared, and that's not what's happening now. One party may be prepared, but not both of them. And then I think the other part that's really important is they need to look at the data first before they agree to anything like that. I just had another attorney that I walked through the process, and he's like, well, what if we agree to these rates? And I'm like, don't do that now. Leave the door open to have that discussion with the other side, but don't agree on it now because you have no idea what's in your data. And if you've got a lot of data that's numbers-based or images, it may not be suitable for a predictive coding tool. So just get in there and know what's in your data first before you even have those conversations. And then I think it's a bad idea to do that anyway because you've pinned yourself to something that may not be economically feasible at that point, because if you have to review 500,000 documents to reach that agreed upon level or accuracy rate, then what cost savings did you have if you've got to review that many documents now?
I think meet and confer is going to go more from a checklist type of perspective that I think a lot of attorneys have now. This is what I always ask for into an assessment phase. The importance of assessing your data will be huge as you continue or as we continue into this predictive coding world and big data, right? It's just going to become incredibly important.
Okay, let me ask one last question to the panel. I mean, we've talked, the term has come up several times in this conversation about managed services. And it sounds good, but everybody's got a different conception of what managed services really are. Could you help me understand what are managed services?
Who are you asking?
I'm going to ask Paige, I'm going to ask Palab, and I'm going to ask all of you, actually. I'm going to ask Sonia and Andrew as well.
Who goes first?
Paige.
Let me ask Paige to go first. Yeah.
All right. So in my world, managed services is everything. I have to think about the right way to say this. In my world, managed services is the back end, right? It is housing the infrastructure. It is performing a lot of what I would call the commodity work, stuff that as a law firm director, I can't bill out $275 an hour, $250 an hour to have people load data into a database. That doesn't make sense, right? So that kind of more commoditized role of the discovery, litigation support role, that's part of managed services. What is not part for me is the project management. I think there's a component of project management that is required for every vendor, but the strategic kind of project management consulting, that's what I want to keep in-house. That's not part of my managed service model.
Okay. Bob, you want to add something to that?
Sure. I mean, I have a different perspective because I'm from the corporation, not law firm.
Right.
So I think managed services falls under two categories. One is managed document review, which can be done by staff attorneys, maybe by a document review vendor, and there is managed discovery services. So one, I think, as essentially the entire technology stack, guiding the corporation about best practices as far as handling the data is concerned. And I would almost say taking it to the point of here is the data, stage for the next step. That's managed discovery services. And then managed review services, which can involve the managed discovery services vendor, outside counsel, in-house counsel, everyone, is how do we do the rest of the steps in the most cost-effective manner without, killing us in the process.
Sonia, you want to add something?
I guess I look at managed services as go to where the expertise is. So if someone does this particular job day in, day out, and you don't have that expertise in-house, either at the corporation or the law firm, then go to the expert. I think Palab hit it on the head when he said efficiency. It's about what's the most efficient process and workflow, and working with the parties that have that. If you're a serial litigant, then maybe it makes sense to bring it in-house. If you're not and you do 1 or 2 cases a year, maybe it makes sense to go to a managed service vendor who can actually handle those kind of things from a subject matter expertise, or go to a law firm who has that same kind of expertise. So I think managed services depends on what your purpose is and what expertise is needed.
Andrew, last word?
I'll just, I guess the best way to frame it is like, services managed by someone else. right? And so
Make it go away.
and this means different things to different people, right? So some people have the infrastructure, but they don't want to run it. They don't want to be responsible for taking care of it. Some people don't want to manage the infrastructure, but want to do everything else. It means different things to different people, right? But I think one of the advantages of getting in these managed service relationships where someone does take care of the infrastructure, does that commodity work that we talked about, is those processes get built, right? And they're predicted, repeated, and they get better over time, right? And that's why you hire these people to manage these services you don't want to do, to be super efficient there. And they're incentivized.
And can I make a comment? The technology is changing all the time.
Right.
Would we rather do it inside the corporation where you can't really train people that rapidly, or throw it over to Andy to do it?
Yes, and another thing is like this business is very spiky, right? It's not steady state.
Yeah.
It's like I got low volume here, and then oh my gosh, there's a ton of work, right? And sometimes like managing those spikes is very difficult for a law firm or a corporation to staff for. But these guys are in perfect position to do it.
I have just one follow-up comment too. The part about keeping project management and consulting in-house, my rationale on that candidly is most vendors I find don't have a very deep bench when it comes to high-end project management and project managers and consultants. So that's why I've had to build my internal team. There are very few vendors out there that have a deep bench, and candidly, I've been really impressed with SFL. That's one of the reasons we've started doing business with them, is that they have an A team and a deep team that I can call up and say, take this call with this lawyer, I can't assess this case, I got to go on to something else. I feel comfortable about that, but that's not the norm in the industry from my perspective. I think anybody can do the churn and burn work, if you will. That's the part that's easy to commoditize and have the efficiencies there. So, again, that's why we want that stuff out. But so far, that's why I'm keeping consulting in-house.
Great. Well, with that great commercial, let me thank the panel, and join me in thanking the panel.